He hid an Apache spy in his cellar. But then lights flashed from every mountaintop. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The wind howled across the wide, barren plains of the American West, the sound like the mournful cry of a lost soul. In the middle of nowhere, there was a small farmhouse, weathered by time and isolated from the rest of the world. It had been years since anyone had visited this house, and its owner, a quiet rancher named Thomas Hale, preferred it that way. He had no family, no neighbors, and no need for company. But that all changed one fateful night. It was a stormy evening when Thomas first heard the desperate knock at his door. He opened it cautiously, rifle in hand, prepared for trouble. Standing there in the rain was a woman, drenched, her clothes tattered, and her eyes filled with a silent plea for help. She spoke quickly, in a language Thomas didn't understand, but there was no mistaking the fear in her voice. Without thinking, he pulled her inside, away from the cold and the storm. Thomas had heard whispers of the Apache tribes, their people often portrayed as enemies by the settlers in the region. But this woman, this stranger, was in need of his help. He set aside his fears and offered her shelter, offering a warm fire and food. She seemed to relax only slightly as she accepted his generosity, but Thomas could sense the tension in her. She wasn't just any stranger, she was different. Her presence felt like a puzzle, pieces missing but slowly beginning to fit together. As the night wore on, the woman's silence grew heavier. Her eyes darted toward the window, and then back to Thomas, as though she was waiting for something or someone. Thomas didn't understand it, but he knew something was wrong. The storm outside intensified, but it wasn't the wind or rain that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a soft rustle from the cellar door. His heart raced as he grabbed his rifle and made his way downstairs. There, in the dim light, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A man, crouched low, trying to make himself invisible. He was Native American, his face painted in war colors. Thomas hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before he could act, the woman from the porch appeared behind him, her hand on his shoulder. "Don't shoot," she whispered, her voice steady but urgent. "He's with me." Thomas turned, staring at her in disbelief. She was hiding an Apache warrior in his cellar? He couldn't believe it. She must have noticed his shock, because she quickly added, "He's not a threat. He's a spy." The word hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. A spy? What did that mean for him? What was she involved in? The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something more than fear in them, something that resembled trust. She had placed her life in his hands, and now she was asking for his protection. But there was more to the story, something far larger than he could have ever imagined. As Thomas tried to make sense of the situation, something strange happened. Lights flickered in the distance, far off in the mountains. At first, he thought it was just the storm playing tricks on his eyes, but then the lights grew brighter and more intense. They flashed from every mountaintop, as if they were signaling to someone. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What did it all mean? And why was it happening now, just as he had made the decision to shelter this mysterious woman? As the lights flashed in the distance, Thomas realized that the world he had known, the quiet, simple life on his farm, was about to be turned upside down. Little did he know, the woman he had saved was not just a fugitive, but the key to something much larger, a conflict that had been brewing for years, one that would change the fate of everyone involved. As the storm raged outside, Thomas Hale stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the figure in his cellar. The Apache warrior, now standing, looked no less imposing than he had in the darkness. He was a tall man, his features sharp, with dark eyes that seemed to see right through him. The woman from the porch stood beside Thomas, her hand still resting on his shoulder, a silent plea in her gaze. "He's with me," she had said, but Thomas wasn't sure what that meant yet. What was going on? Why was she hiding this man in his cellar? And why had the lights begun flashing from the mountain tops? The question spun in his mind like the wind howling outside. The woman's gaze was full of urgency. She turned to the warrior and spoke to him in a language Thomas didn't understand, her voice low but commanding. The warrior nodded slightly before looking back at Thomas. The air in the room grew heavy, and Thomas could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but something told him not to. Instead, he slowly lowered his rifle and set it aside, the decision feeling like the right one, even if he couldn't explain why. "What's happening?" Thomas finally asked, his voice hoarse. The woman hesitated, glancing toward the window, her face strained with fear. "They know," she said quietly. "They know where I am." "Who knows?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. "The Apache. The soldiers. Both of them," she replied, her eyes narrowing with the intensity of the moment. "But the lights mean they've found us. It's only a matter of time before they come here." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The lights. He had seen them, high up on the mountain tops. They had been flashing in a pattern, synchronized, as though they were signaling each other. But what did it mean? Who was sending them? "What do you need me to do?" Thomas asked, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. The woman turned to him, her eyes full of gratitude but also a deep sadness. "Keep us safe," she said simply. "If they come, we'll have to fight. But if you help us now, we can avoid that. We can escape." The weight of her words settled in the room, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm outside, beating against the house. Thomas had lived his life alone, never asking for trouble. But somehow, trouble had found him, and now he had to make a choice. The peaceful life he had known was slipping away, replaced by something much bigger and far more dangerous. He nodded slowly, though he didn't fully understand what was at stake. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. The woman's face softened with relief, and she stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. The warrior gave a slight nod, acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. But as Thomas glanced back at the flashing lights, he felt a sense of foreboding. It wasn't just the Apache or the soldiers he had to worry about now. Something far more sinister was on its way. Over the next few hours, the tension inside the house grew. The woman, whose name was revealed to be Ayanna, kept watch at the window, her sharp eyes scanning the distance. The warrior, whose name was Rouse, silently moved around the house, checking every door and window. Thomas, feeling both out of place and strangely connected to these strangers, followed their lead. He had lived in isolation for so long, but now he was involved in something much larger than himself. He could feel it in his bones. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break inside his home. As the night wore on, the flashing lights from the mountains grew brighter, more frequent. Thomas could hear the sound of hooves in the distance, but he couldn't tell how far away they were. The tension was unbearable. Ayanna and Rouse had prepared themselves for whatever was coming, but Thomas was still trying to make sense of everything. His world was being turned upside down, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences. The first sound of approaching riders was faint at first, but as it grew louder, Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Ayanna and Rouse. They were ready. The battle, if it came, was about to begin. But Thomas wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something he couldn't yet understand but knew was worth protecting. The sound of hooves grew louder, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the earth beneath Thomas's feet. He stood near the window, peering into the night, trying to make out the figures in the distance. His hand tightened around the rifle, the weight of the weapon suddenly feeling like a heavy burden. Ayanna and Rouse were both silent, waiting, watching, their faces tense with the knowledge of what was about to happen. The flashing lights in the distance had stopped, but their significance hung in the air like an ominous shadow. It was only a matter of time before the riders arrived, and Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been a man to fear much. He had lived alone for years, facing the solitude of the land with quiet determination. But now, surrounded by these strangers, in the middle of a storm, his world felt anything but stable. He had helped them, yes, but in doing so, he had entered a conflict he never wanted. The sound of the hooves now grew into a thunderous charge, and with it, the inevitability of the confrontation. Ayanna's eyes met his. There was no fear in her gaze, only resolve. "Get ready," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're coming." Rouse stood silently, his presence almost ghostly as he moved to the door, checking the lock and the windows. Thomas could see that this was more than just a fight. It was a reckoning. Ayanna had made it clear that she was not just running from the Apache warriors or the soldiers. There was something deeper, something that tied her fate to this moment. "We don't have much time," Ayanna said, her voice low. "The soldiers will come from one direction, the Apache from another. We need to hold them off long enough to get out of here." Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure how they planned to do that. He had never been in a fight like this before. The world he knew was one of cattle and land, not battlefields. But the look in Ayanna's eyes told him there was no turning back now. The tension in the room was palpable. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind outside, felt like a countdown. The riders were getting closer, and soon, the storm wouldn't be the only thing they had to worry about. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound of hooves stopped. The silence was deafening. Ayanna and Rouse froze, their bodies coiled with anticipation. Thomas could feel his pulse in his throat. The tension was unbearable. And then, as if on cue, the door to the cellar creaked open. The dim light from the lantern flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened, his heart racing. This was it. The riders were here. The door opened wider, and from the shadows stepped a man. He was tall, dressed in the worn clothes of a soldier, but his eyes were dark and wild, the kind of eyes that told Thomas this man had seen more than his fair share of bloodshed. "It's over," the soldier said, his voice gruff but steady. "We know you're hiding an Apache spy. You can't keep running." Thomas's stomach dropped. He had hoped for a different outcome, but the harsh reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no bargaining with this man, no convincing him to leave. The soldier's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, and the tension in the room was electric. But Ayanna didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the soldier's face. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said, her voice unwavering. "You'll regret this." The soldier scoffed, but something in Ayanna's demeanor made him pause. Thomas watched as she stood there, calm and defiant, as if she had faced far worse threats than this before. And for a moment, just a moment, Thomas saw a flicker of uncertainty in the soldier's eyes. Ayanna took another step forward, and then, in a blur of motion, she grabbed a small knife from her belt and slashed the soldier's sword arm, causing him to stumble back in surprise. Before he could react, she lunged forward, knocking him to the ground. The warrior Rouse, who had remained silent until now, moved like a shadow, disarming the man with a swift, practiced motion. Within seconds, the soldier was on the ground, bound and helpless. Ayanna stood over him, her chest heaving with exertion. "Leave. Now," she commanded, her voice cold. The soldier, still reeling from the shock of the attack, nodded quickly, scrambling to his feet and fleeing into the night. The tension in the room did not dissipate immediately. Thomas stood there, his heart still racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He had expected a battle, but this was something else. The world he had known was slipping away, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. Ayanna turned to Thomas and Rouse, her face softened but still fierce. "That was only the beginning. They will be back," she said. "We need to leave now." The lights from the mountains had stopped flashing, but Thomas knew that was only a temporary reprieve. The Apache and the soldiers were both closing in. The storm outside had nothing on the storm that was about to break over them. And Thomas, for the first time in his life, was caught in the middle of it. The tension in the room was thick, and Thomas could feel it pressing down on him. The soldier had fled, but Ayanna's words hung heavy in the air. That was only the beginning. They will be back. The storm outside still raged, and now, in the eerie silence that followed the confrontation, Thomas could hear the distant sounds of hooves once again. This time, it wasn't just one or two riders. It was a large group, and they were heading straight for the house. Ayanna and Rouse were already preparing. Ayanna moved to the back of the room, rummaging through a small bag she had brought with her. She pulled out a knife, its blade sharp and gleaming in the low light. Rouse, ever the silent warrior, was checking the windows and doors, ensuring everything was secure. Thomas watched them, still trying to process everything that had happened. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was something much bigger. Ayanna had warned him that the Apache and the soldiers were both coming for them. But now, as the hooves grew louder, Thomas couldn't help but wonder how many more would be involved. How many lives would be at stake before the night was over? The lights from the mountain peaks had faded, but something told Thomas that the calm was only temporary. He stepped forward, his hands still shaking slightly from the rush of the earlier fight. "How many are coming?" he asked, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. Ayanna paused for a moment, glancing out the window as if she could see them already. "More than enough," she replied, her voice calm but full of the urgency that was beginning to fill Thomas's chest. "We can't outrun them. We have to stand our ground." Thomas looked over at Rouse, who nodded once, a signal that he was ready. It was clear that Ayanna and Rouse had faced danger like this before. They were ready for battle. But Thomas wasn't sure if he was. He had never fought a battle like this, never had to defend against a group that might be both Apache warriors and soldiers. As he prepared to follow their lead, Ayanna spoke again, this time with a hint of something almost like a warning. "The Apache will be here first," she said. "They're swift, silent, but they don't want to fight unless it's necessary. The soldiers, though, they'll come with guns blazing. They don't care who they hurt." Thomas nodded, swallowing his fear. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He had made a choice when he decided to help Ayanna, and there was no turning back. The sounds of the approaching riders were growing louder. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The house, small and isolated, didn't stand a chance against an army. But he wasn't just going to stand there and wait to be overrun. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight. Ayanna looked at him, her gaze steady. "We fight," she said, her words final. "We hold them off as long as we can. And when the time comes, we leave." The last part of her sentence seemed to linger in the air, as if she knew something Thomas didn't. As if she had already accepted the fact that leaving wasn't going to be easy. "How?" Thomas asked. "There's only 3 of us." "It's not the numbers that matter," Ayanna replied. "It's the will to fight, and the strength to survive." Thomas wasn't sure if he believed her, but he knew one thing for certain. He was in this now. The sound of the hooves had stopped. There was a moment of quiet, a breathless stillness that felt heavier than the storm outside. Thomas's hand tightened around his rifle once more, his knuckles white. He could hear the sound of voices now, low and indistinct, but definitely growing closer. Then, suddenly, Ayanna motioned for them to move. Without a word, they all took positions. Ayanna was at the back window, Rouse crouched near the front door, and Thomas stood near the stairwell, rifle in hand, ready for whatever came next. The door burst open. A group of Apache warriors stepped into the room, their movements swift and precise. They were armed, but their eyes weren't filled with rage, only determination. The leader of the group stepped forward, his gaze locking with Ayanna's. "We've come for you," he said, his voice rough but not hostile. "The soldiers are close behind. We cannot hold them off for long." Thomas could see the weariness in their eyes, the same weariness that had come over him when he realized the fight wasn't just for survival. It was for something more. Ayanna met the warrior's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied, "but we will not go down without a fight." She turned to Thomas and Rouse. "Get ready," she said quietly. Thomas felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. There was no turning back now. The battle for their lives had begun. The Apache warriors moved swiftly through the house, their eyes scanning every corner, their hands ready on the hilts of their weapons. Thomas felt his heart pounding in his chest as he stood at the ready, rifle in hand, prepared for whatever came next. Ayanna and Rouse were already in position, their bodies tense, ready to react at a moment's notice. The leader of the Apache warriors, a tall man with sharp eyes and a face marked by scars, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Ayanna. "We have to move," he said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. "The soldiers are closing in. They know where we are. They'll be here soon." Ayanna nodded, her face betraying no emotion, but Thomas could see the weight of the situation in her eyes. They had fought to get this far, but now, the real battle was just beginning. The warrior leader turned to Thomas, his gaze steady and serious. "You must stay with us," he said. "You will not survive this alone. We need to work together, or we will all fall." Thomas swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had never been part of something like this. His life had always been quiet, just him and his land. But now, he was caught in a struggle far bigger than himself. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice hoarse. But I don't know what's coming. You don't need to know, Ayana replied, her voice firm. Just follow our lead, and we'll make it through. The words felt like a promise, but Thomas wasn't sure if it was one he could trust. The warriors had already begun moving into position, their weapons drawn, ready to face whatever was coming. Thomas followed their lead, moving silently through the house, taking cover near the door. He could hear the sound of hooves once again, this time closer, much closer. The soldiers had arrived. Ayana motioned for them to be quiet. She moved to the front of the house, crouching low behind a window, her eyes focused on the approaching soldiers. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he followed her, his rifle still in hand, his body tense. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure. It was going to be a fight for survival. The soldiers rode into view, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. There were at least a dozen of them, all armed and wearing the distinct uniform of the army. They rode with purpose, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the area as they neared the house. Thomas could feel the fear rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. There was no time for fear now. The soldiers were getting closer, and soon, they would be at the door. Ayana motioned for them to get ready. She stood up slowly, stepping away from the window. They're not here for conversation, she said quietly. We need to be ready for anything. Thomas nodded, tightening his grip on the rifle. He was ready, though he wasn't sure how much help he could be. The Apache warriors around him were well trained, but he was just a rancher. He had no experience in combat, no knowledge of what was to come. The sound of hooves grew louder. The soldiers were almost at the door. Thomas could feel his pulse racing, his thoughts spinning. Ayana stepped forward, motioning for them to stay low. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with determination. When they come in, she said, we fight. No hesitation. We protect the house. The words felt like a command, and Thomas could see the warriors around him nodding in agreement. They were ready, and for the first time in his life, Thomas felt something deep inside him shift. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He wasn't just a man trying to protect his land. He was part of something bigger now, something that could change everything. The soldiers were at the door now, and there was no turning back. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The door burst open, and the soldiers flooded into the room, their weapons drawn. Ayana moved first, her body a blur as she struck one soldier down with a swift, powerful motion. Rouse followed, his movements precise and deadly. Thomas fired his rifle for the first time, the loud crack of the shot echoing in the room. The soldier he aimed at stumbled back, his hand clutching his chest, but he didn't fall. Another soldier moved forward, raising his gun, but Ayana was already on him, knocking the weapon from his hands before delivering a crushing blow. The room exploded into chaos. Soldiers were falling, but so were the Apache warriors. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. But Ayana and her warriors fought with the ferocity of people who had nothing left to lose. Thomas followed their lead, firing when he had to, taking cover when necessary. The room felt small, cramped with the noise of gunfire and the rush of adrenaline. The battle raged on, and it was clear that they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something more, something Thomas didn't yet understand, but he knew was worth fighting for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the soldiers began to retreat. Their numbers had been thinned, and the remaining soldiers quickly realized they were outmatched. Ayana and her warriors stood victorious, but the cost had been high. Thomas looked around the room, his heart still pounding in his chest. The fight wasn't over, but they had survived. For now, that was enough. The dust from the battle had barely settled when Thomas Hale realized the cost of their victory. The soldiers had retreated, but the air still hummed with the tension of what had just transpired. He stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the remnants of the fight, broken furniture, spent ammunition, and the bodies of fallen warriors. His hands were shaking, the weight of the rifle still heavy in his grasp. Ayana and Rouse were tending to the wounded, their movements efficient and calm, as if they had done this countless times before. But Thomas could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the price of survival etched into their faces. He knew they weren't out of danger yet. The soldiers would return. This was just the beginning. The Apache warriors, though victorious, were battered. They had taken losses, and Thomas couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had only fired a few shots, and though they had helped turn the tide of the battle, it felt insignificant in the face of the sacrifices made by the warriors around him. "We need to move," Ayanna said quietly, breaking his thoughts. She looked up from one of the fallen Apache, her face set in determination. "The soldiers won't be gone long. We have to be ready." Thomas nodded, his mind still reeling from the chaos of the fight. "Where do we go?" he asked. Ayanna glanced toward the window, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. "The mountains. We can hide there, regroup. It's the only place we'll be safe for now." Thomas didn't argue. He had no experience with the terrain, no knowledge of the mountains, but he trusted Ayanna. If she said it was their best chance, he believed her. The warriors gathered their belongings, their movements swift, yet there was an air of sadness to them now. The victory had been hard-earned, and no one celebrated. The realization that they weren't safe yet weighed heavily on everyone. Rouse, who had been quiet throughout the battle, moved toward Thomas. He had a stern look in his eyes, and Thomas could sense that something was on his mind. "You fought well," Rouse said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. The soldiers may have retreated, but they'll be back in greater numbers. And the Apache are not the only ones after us." Thomas looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Rouse's gaze darkened, and he motioned toward Ayanna, who was organizing the warriors. "The Apache have their own enemies. The soldiers are just one threat. But there are others, men who seek power, who would do anything to control the land." Thomas's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. He had known the Apache had enemies, but he hadn't realized the full scope of what they were up against. And now, somehow, he was a part of it all. Ayanna returned to their side, her face resolute. "We leave in an hour. Pack what you can, but leave the rest. We won't be able to carry everything." She moved away quickly, speaking with the warriors in hushed tones. Rouse followed her, leaving Thomas standing in the room, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. There was no turning back now. The battle was just a prelude to something much bigger, and Thomas was in the middle of it all. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. He moved quickly, grabbing his gear and preparing for the journey. The weight of the rifle on his back felt heavier than ever, but this time, it wasn't just the weapon that was burdening him. It was the knowledge that the path ahead would be filled with danger, uncertainty, and perhaps even more battles. But as he glanced at Ayanna, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment, he understood. They were in this together, and no matter what came next, they would fight until the end. The journey to the mountains would be their next test, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something even greater was waiting for them. The soldiers were just the beginning, and as the last of the warriors filed out of the house, Thomas followed, determined to survive. For Ayanna, for the Apache, and for himself. The journey to the mountains was harder than Thomas had imagined. The terrain was rough, with rocky outcroppings and thick brush, making each step a struggle. But the Apache warriors, though weary from the earlier battle, moved with the sure-footedness of those who knew the land like the back of their hands. Ayanna led them, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, her body coiled with the same tension Thomas felt, but couldn't quite explain. Rouse was close behind her, his silent presence both reassuring and unnerving. Thomas had learned that the warrior's silence wasn't born of fear, but of concentration. He had the kind of focus that came with years of survival. It was something Thomas admired but felt he would never truly understand. As they moved deeper into the mountains, the sounds of the world seemed to fade away. The hooves of their horses barely made a sound on the soft earth, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and fresh rain. Yet, despite the quiet beauty of the landscape, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger that hung over them. Every rustling leaf, every distant bird call, seemed like a warning. It wasn't just the soldiers or the Apache that they had to worry about. There were others, hidden enemies, people who would stop at nothing to see them destroyed. After hours of travel, they reached a small clearing at the base of a steep cliff. Ayanna signaled for them to stop. "We'll make camp here," she said, her voice low but firm. Thomas was exhausted, but he didn't argue. He had learned to follow her lead, and so far, she hadn't steered them wrong. The warriors dismounted, moving quickly and efficiently to set up camp. Fires were built, tents were erected, and food was prepared with a practiced ease that left Thomas in awe. He had expected a much longer, more difficult process, but the Apache worked as if they had done this 1,000 times before. As the campfire crackled and the smell of roasting meat filled the air, Thomas sat down beside Ayanna. "How long before they find us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayanna looked at him, her face unreadable in the firelight. "It depends," she said after a moment. "The soldiers will likely track us, but they won't be able to follow us into the mountains easily. The Apache, however, will know where we are within a day." The lights, they were a signal. A warning. Thomas nodded, understanding now that the battle was far from over. They had made it through the first confrontation, but the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. He looked around at the warriors, all of them exhausted but alert. They had been through much, but Thomas could see that they weren't ready to stop. "You're not like the others," Ayanna said suddenly, breaking his thoughts. "Most people wouldn't help a stranger like you did. They would have turned me in. Why didn't you?" Thomas looked at her, trying to find the right words. He wasn't sure why he had helped her. It wasn't something he had planned. He just couldn't turn her away when she was in need. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess I just couldn't watch you suffer. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I've seen enough pain in my life to know when someone needs help." Ayanna studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "But this isn't over. The soldiers will come again, and the Apache will follow. We will have to fight, and we will have to win." Thomas wasn't sure what she meant by that. Win what? The war? He didn't know if he was ready for that kind of fight, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't back out now. The lights in the mountains had been a warning, a sign that something much bigger than the soldiers was coming, and it was coming for them. As the night stretched on, Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. His mind was spinning with thoughts of what the future held. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He knew there was no going back. The journey had already begun, and he would see it through, no matter where it led. The sound of the fire crackling in the night was comforting, and for a brief moment, Thomas allowed himself to relax. The world felt distant here in the mountains, but it wasn't the peace he had known on his farm. It was a different kind of peace, one born of survival, of strength, and of the knowledge that whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone. The night passed slowly in the mountains, the campfire's glow flickering against the darkened silhouettes of the trees. Thomas couldn't sleep, his thoughts racing through the events of the day. The battle had been intense, and though they had survived, the tension in the air was undeniable. The soldiers were still out there, and now the Apache, the very people Ayanna had once fled from, were on their way. The warriors around him were silent, lost in their own thoughts, but it was Ayanna's silence that stood out to him the most. She hadn't said much since their escape into the mountains. She was always alert, eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a silent sentinel. But there was something in the way she moved now, something heavier about her than before. Thomas had seen it in the eyes of people who had been through too much, an acceptance of something darker that had come to define their lives. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Ayanna gathered the group, her voice cutting through the still morning air. "We leave now," she said, her tone sharp. "We cannot afford to wait any longer. They will be looking for us." Rouse was already up, checking their weapons and their horses, his movements swift and precise. The warriors followed suit, their expressions unreadable, their faces marked by the strain of battle. Thomas moved to join them, the weight of his rifle now feeling familiar in his grip. The journey had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had been a simple rancher, but now he was part of something much larger, something that would change his life forever. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked as he caught up with Ayanna. She turned to him, her eyes dark, but there was a flicker of something in them, something almost like regret. "We need to get to the next valley," she said, her voice quieter now, as though she was revealing something she hadn't wanted to share. "It's a place of refuge, a place where we can rest and regroup. But it's not safe. The soldiers will follow, and the Apache will be close behind. We will have to fight our way through." Thomas didn't question her. He had seen her in action. He knew she was a leader, someone who could get them through whatever came next. They moved swiftly, the sound of hooves muffled by the thick ground cover. The air was cooler than the day before, the mountains still heavy with the remnants of the storm. As they climbed higher, The terrain became even more rugged, and Thomas struggled to keep pace. He was no mountain man, but the Apache were, and they moved like shadows through the rocks and trees, their quiet steps a testament to their connection to the land. Hours passed, the sun rising higher in the sky. Thomas could feel the fatigue settling in, but he pushed forward, determined to keep up with them. Ayanna and Rouse led the way, moving with an almost unnatural grace. But it wasn't just the physical journey that weighed on Thomas. It was the knowledge that they were being hunted. The soldiers, the Apache, all closing in on them. Ayanna had been right. This was only the beginning. As the day wore on, the group began to move more cautiously. They stopped often to listen for any signs of pursuit, but each time, the silence around them remained unbroken. The deeper they moved into the mountains, the more Thomas felt the weight of the journey pressing down on him. It wasn't just the soldiers or the Apache that they had to worry about. It was the knowledge that no one would stop looking for them. Not until they were found. By late afternoon, the valley Ayanna had mentioned came into view. It was a small, secluded place, hidden between two high ridges. The ground was flat, the trees thick, and the air cool. It looked like a safe haven, but Thomas knew better. Ayanna didn't speak much as they approached the valley, her eyes scanning the area, alert to any signs of danger. The warriors began to spread out, setting up camp as Ayanna gave orders in low tones. Thomas felt a flicker of hope as he dismounted, the quiet valley offering a brief respite from the chaos. But as the warriors settled in and the sun began to set, the sense of unease returned. The silence was too perfect. It felt wrong. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked quietly, stepping up to Ayanna as she stood by the edge of the camp, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She turned to him, her face shadowed in the dimming light. "We're not safe here," she said softly. "They will find us. And when they do, we'll have to fight again. But this time, it's going to be different." Thomas looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had known this was coming, but hearing it from Ayanna, the person who had led them this far, made it real. "How different?" he asked. Ayanna didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees, her eyes distant. Finally, she spoke. "The Apache are not the only ones we're fighting now. The soldiers were just the start. There are others, men who will stop at nothing to see us destroyed." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The battle was far from over, and it was only getting started. The days that followed were filled with constant movement and uncertainty. Ayanna's warning had proved true. The Apache were close behind, but it was the soldiers that were the bigger threat. Their pursuit was relentless, and it wasn't just about finding them anymore. It was about destroying everything they stood for. Every camp they set up was short-lived. Every rest they managed was interrupted by the constant fear of being found. The soldiers were always one step behind, but it wasn't just soldiers anymore. There were mercenaries, hired guns, men with no allegiance except to the highest bidder. They were closing in from all sides, and Ayanna knew it wouldn't be long before the final battle came. Thomas had grown used to the tension. His body ached from the constant travel, and his mind was weary from the never-ending fear of being hunted. But what weighed on him the most was the silence between him and Ayanna. She had become more distant, not just from him, but from the warriors too. She was carrying the burden of leadership, the weight of their survival, and Thomas could see the strain in her eyes. He knew she was doing everything she could to keep them safe, but he couldn't help but wonder how long she could hold on. On the morning of the final confrontation, the skies were clear, but the air felt thick with anticipation. They had reached a small valley, nestled between two jagged peaks, a place that had once offered them refuge. Now, it was nothing more than a trap. Ayanna stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the valley, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. Rouse was nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rest of the warriors were preparing for what they all knew was coming. Thomas approached Ayanna, his footsteps light on the soft earth. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, and he knew this would be the moment that would decide everything. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Ayanna didn't turn to face him, but her voice was steady. "As ready as I'll ever be." There was a quiet finality in her words, an acceptance that what they had been running from was now unavoidable. Thomas stood beside her, watching the horizon with her. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the soft murmur of the warriors preparing in the background. But it all felt distant, as though they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a battle. He turned to Ayanna, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm with you," he said simply. She nodded, the faintest flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She was a leader, and in that moment, she needed no one's reassurance. But Thomas felt something shift in him. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the paralyzing kind. He had made his choice. No matter what happened next, he would face it, not as a rancher, but as a part of something far greater than himself. The sound of hooves in the distance snapped him out of his thoughts. The enemy was coming. Ayanna motioned for the warriors to take their positions. Thomas followed her lead, finding a place on the ridge where he could see the valley below. The first wave of soldiers appeared, riding in a tight formation, their faces set in grim determination. They didn't expect a fight, not yet. They didn't know that Ayanna and her warriors had already prepared. As the soldiers moved closer, Ayanna signaled the attack. It came in an instant. Warriors emerged from the shadows, charging with the force of a storm. The soldiers were caught off guard, and for a brief moment, the valley was filled with chaos. Thomas fired his rifle, the sharp crack of the shot ringing in his ears as a soldier fell. But the battle was far from over. The soldiers regrouped quickly, and the mercenaries, who had been lurking on the outskirts, moved in. The fight was brutal, each side pushing forward, determined to emerge victorious. Thomas found himself in the thick of it, his rifle a constant companion as he fought alongside the Apache warriors. He moved with a sense of purpose now, not just fighting for his own survival, but for Ayanna, for Rouse, and for the future they had all dreamed of. The battle raged on, and though the warriors fought with everything they had, it became clear that they were outnumbered. But Ayanna wasn't giving up. Her blade flashed through the air, cutting down anyone who came too close, her movements as fluid as the wind. She was a force of nature, and for a moment, Thomas couldn't help but feel awe for the woman who had led them this far. The fight seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, as the sun began to set, the tide began to turn. The soldiers, their numbers dwindling, began to retreat. The mercenaries followed, but their resolve had already broken. Ayanna's warriors had held the line, and they had won. As the last of the enemy retreated, Thomas stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The valley was quiet once more, but it was a silence filled with the weight of what had just happened. They had won, but the cost had been high. The warriors were injured, some gravely, and there were losses that could never be replaced. Ayanna stood at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the valley, her face unreadable. "We've won," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "But the war isn't over." Thomas stood beside her, the setting sun casting a long shadow across the land. "No," he said, his voice steady. "It's only just begun. Immerse yourself in thrilling Western stories where survival, courage, and loyalty are tested against the harsh backdrop of the American frontier. In these captivating Western stories, a lone rancher finds himself thrust into a battle for survival when he decides to help an Apache woman fleeing from both soldiers and mercenaries. As they navigate treacherous mountain paths, they are pursued by enemies on all sides, and every choice becomes a matter of life and death. These Western stories are filled with intense action, deep emotional struggles, and characters forced to confront their fears. The bond between the rancher, the Apache warriors, and the woman they protect grows stronger as they fight for freedom and a chance at survival. As the stakes rise, alliances are tested, and the line between right and wrong becomes blurred. These gripping Western stories take you on a journey where honor and bravery can change the fate of all involved. With each turn, the characters must face dangerous enemies, including soldiers and those who seek power for themselves. The battle for survival is relentless, and in these Western stories, every victory comes with a price. If you're looking for unforgettable Western stories that blend raw action with powerful human emotion, this is the tale that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Discover the epic journey of a rancher caught in a fight for his life and the lives of those he has come to protect in these action-packed Western stories. Watch as the characters struggle with choices that will define their fates in this relentless adventure, where the only certainty is that nothing is ever truly safe in the wild untamed lands of the American West.